Just want to get the immediate reaction from our colleague Andrew Clennell. And Andrew, you said it would be a low number. It certainly is. And as Ed rightly points out, we're talking about the lowest figures here in growth terms since the early 90s off the back of that recession.
Yes, but I'll tell you what, they'll be breathing a sigh of relief, the government, I reckon, because you get one negative quarter and then you can get a second. And I think they've escaped again, at least from that perception point of view. They could argue our plan's working, or we just don't need another Reserve Bank hike. They're very much a case for that now. I mean, Warren Hogan's wrong, Kieran. Hate to say it. Hope Warren's listening. Mate, you are wrong. We do not need another reserve rate hike in this economy. That inflation number is going to come down regardless. And in terms of where growth's at, well, we're going to have tax cuts feed into it next quarter, aren't we? So it's a waiting game for the government, a patience game for the Reserve Bank as well. I think the government would be as happy as you can be with where that's at. It's not a figure any of us should be happy with. It's certainly not a figure business would be happy with. The other thing that's going to feed into this is they are cutting net migration, the government. So given that it's a GDP per capita recession, that has the risk, and they've been cutting that since about January, by the way, that has the risk of driving you into recession, technical recession. That hasn't occurred. These numbers actually matter. If you say you're in recession, it affects all kinds of consumer and business decisions. The fact we can point to some anemic growth and the Treasurer can, confidence is a big thing. So, look, I think they're certainly not going to be happy about it, but I've said to you before, lucky Chalmers, I'm going to say it again to you, Kieran, Jim Chalmers, he has a bit of luck. Now, he would say, well, you make your own luck, son, but I don't know. He has a bit of luck. The luck is 0.2%. That's where his luck is. Last quarter, it was 0.1%. How close is that to a technical recession? It's 0.2 and 0.1 from going negative, and he's escaped again, the Treasurer. So there you have it. He set the scene, obviously worried about the number. Must be, market expectations are pretty right again. And now we just need to keep this hovering along the surface to convince the Reserve Bank to give us a rate cut later in the year and not early next year. Can't see that happening with inflation where it is, but I'll tell you what, I'll be betting on a February rate cut. I really would.
It's certainly looking that way, isn't it, Andrew? And Ed Boyd, just to pick up on what Andrew's saying there, so close to this being an actual recession as opposed to the per capita recession, which you've been reporting on now for some time, Ed. This, when you look at the government consumption, up 0.3%, the public sector, the government spending, without it, we would be in recession, no doubt about it.
It certainly looks that way, Kieran. Obviously, the government has really picked up its spending in the past couple of years, and clearly we're now in the third quarter of the year where there's obviously more tax cuts coming for Australians, and there's also big energy rebates going out to every Australian household and business. So expect government spending to actually accelerate further in this second half of this financial year. I think one of the key reasons why economic growth was so weak, the Bureau of Statistics calls it out, is household consumption actually fell. It said household consumption or spending from Australian households was its lowest level in the June quarter since September 2021, which was the Delta variant lockdown of COVID-19. So households have really been crunched in the June quarter. They've stopped spending money. At the same time, though, we have the government spending more money. So there are two contrasting things here that are basically pulling each other in different directions. So it's causing problems here for Australia's economy. 0.2% growth is incredibly weak. And as Andrew says, it's very close to zero or very close to negative. Like, statistically, you are virtually right there. So this is obviously an issue. But the Reserve Bank, looking at their forecasts for the next couple of quarters of growth, they actually expect Australia's economic growth to pick up quite substantially. By December quarter this year, they're expecting GDP growth of 1.7%, which would be a pretty fast and rapid acceleration. And then they expect GDP growth of 2.6% at an annual rate by June of next year. So within 12 months, the Reserve Bank expects the economy to really pick up its pace and start expanding at a much more rapid rate than it is right now.
Indeed, and that's part of what the government's hoping for here, Andrew Clennell, that They can navigate this. They're on, we call it the narrow path. We've referred to it ourselves as a goat track in recent times that they're trying to walk along to get to this soft landing. But this comes at such a pivotal time politically, Andrew, as we approach the end of the year and into 2025, which we all know is going to have an election in the first 6 months of that year. So much rests on the next CPI figure, what the RBA does do. Governor Bullock setting expectations that we shouldn't expect a rate cut before the end of the year. Raised a few eyebrows within the government. I know it's annoyed a few people in the government, those comments, but maybe Governor Bullock might have to reverse that given how weak things are in the economy, Andrew.
We should never set these things in stone, should you? But I think what she was trying to do there is warn people not to get too complacent on inflation. So if that in itself has an effect, fair enough. Look, I think Jim Chalmers will be able to get up and say that, the calls for him to slash and burn would have killed the economy and created a lot worse situation than we currently have. And I also think it could be argued, or he could argue, that the RBA has overestimated consumption and public demand, which again, we are closer to a rate cut today than we have been. We are closer to a rate cut today since all these hikes started. That's the number one point out of that. And the other point I would make, again, there aren't great productivity figures in there. There are some bad things for the government in there, especially the overall figure. But once again, how lucky is this Treasurer in the sense he gets 0.2 and 0.1 in 2 quarters? And 2 quarters of negative growth is a technical recession. I mean, how close is he? So I think, he can get up and say, look, Treasury and I have got the budget strategy right. We need growth, but we need inflation to come down first. We do not need any rate hikes. I think he could actually say that. Yep. I know he won't. I know he'll say it's about the independence of the Reserve Bank. But, that is the one thing that could basically ensure Jim Chalmers gets pushed off this path and off a cliff.
Andrew, just to pick up on exactly that point, I've got this statement from the Treasurer. He goes along those lines as close as I guess he's going to in relation to talking about rates. But he says this: the main takeout from these numbers is that consumption fell by 0.2% in the quarter, with people pulling back on discretionary spending to make room for essentials. At the same time, the household saving ratio hit its lowest annual rate in 17 years. So, Ed Boyd, I'll go to you on this one before I get back to Andrew, and as we preview Jim Chalmers coming up shortly. This message from Jim Chalmers, he said it's smashing the economy at the weekend. He won't be backing away from that one bit when it comes to his message on rates today.
Absolutely not. He's going to double down on the fact that what he said earlier, that interest rate rises have been smashing the economy and smashing Australian consumers. So the RBA has lifted rates 13 times. That's the whole point of the Reserve Bank lifting interest rates. It is to crunch consumption, and clearly the figures today are showing that strategy is working. Household consumption has fallen. It's at its weakest level since 2021, and the household savings ratio, as you say, is at its weakest level now in almost 20 years. We are actually going to get a reaction from the Reserve Bank Governor tomorrow. Michelle Bullock is speaking at the Annika Foundation at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, and the topic of her speech is the high costs of inflation for Australia's economy. So expect her to speak in detail about inflation and about interest rates, and there'll obviously be a Q&A session where we can give some questions to her around the level of household consumption, GDP growth in Australia, how weak it is, how close we are to a recession. So that's going to be a highly anticipated public engagement tomorrow from Michelle Bullock.
Indeed. Ed Boyd, thank you very much for that. Andrew, before we wrap up with you, we're going to go to another economist shortly, but I want to talk to you about the broader politics here. Peter Dutton really sharpening his own economic narrative at the same time that he's trying to grapple with a bit of internal dysfunction again, Andrew, which I know you've been keeping a close eye on in Sydney.
I think he'll be relieved that we have this other big economic story, because it's been a bit of a nightmare taking over the New South Wales branch of the Liberal Party, and Peter Dutton seems to be at odds with the New South Wales leader of the Liberal Party, Mark Speakman. I mean, how can they press forward with these state by-elections and a federal election in these kind of circumstances of party disunity? Peter Dutton saying, well, Mark Speakman basically put forward Rob Stokes' name to be on this committee of management taking over from state executive. Rob Stokes, contacted last night, said, no, I never agreed to this. And as I understand it, Mark Speakman contacted Mike Baird, the former Premier. He said no. He contacted Rob Stokes. He never said yes, but he didn't say no. And then he was looking at potentially Arthur Sinodinos or Kerry Chikarovsky or Maurice Payne. But on the record, Mark Speakman is saying they didn't tell us this was definitely happening or on or whatever. So I think Mark Speakman's version of events is I got done over here because Stokes wasn't locked in, where Peter Dutton's version of events is probably, well, Speakman told me Stokes was going to do it. So, I mean, what an absolute mess. It is embarrassing. I know Peter Dutton said it wasn't embarrassing, but I guess he would be tearing his hair out at the New South Wales Liberal Party. The New South Wales Liberal Party would be thinking, why are you getting a couple of Victorians to take over the joint? So there's still going to be friction between factions, friction between state and federal divisions in the lead up to the federal election. That's not good news. I just wanted to raise a couple of other things, Kieran. One is, I've told you what Jim Chalmers' message will probably be, and so have you. Angus Taylor's will be 0.8% decline in productivity. A year ago, we had a 1.5% decline, by the way, but he'll be pointing to that for the quarter as disastrous, and we'll never get inflation down with that. I think that will be the big number for him and the big message. The other thing I wanted to raise is that overnight, there's been an Indian report that there could be a Quad meeting as early as late September, which of course is leaders of India, Japan, the US and Australia, and that could occur in New York on the sidelines of the UN. Now, my understanding is there is likely to be a Quad meeting, but it won't be in New York. So Anthony Albanese, he's already due to go with the G20, etc., the APEC in November. I think he could well be travelling before that as well for that Quad meeting as well.